for his introduction, and I would like to thank the organizers of this workshop for inviting me. My presentation is based on a few chapters of my book on books that came out last year. And the central idea of the book is to look at a particular point in time in Nigerian history that we can talk about the gun society. Pre-colonial African history is replete with narratives and exploits of great men, including Basharu Mola, Ulodogbo Keke, Ulodogbo Abataka Ujonu, and Lewu Babamosa. According to Samuel Johnson, the author of the most famous book on Yoruba history, whenever Ogunmola was angry, he would sit on a keg of empty gunpowder and charge his enemies to war. He is a personal drummer, sensing the kind of heightened emotion of his patron, would then begin to play some edifying tunes just to calm him down. Ogunmola, Ogunmola, Ijagboro, Yo Paedodo, Oyagbe to Biribiri. To a very large extent, the song itself was not only telling Ogunmola to cool down, it was also charging him to war simultaneously. You see, most societies in pre-colonial Yoruba land had similar narratives about warlords who were very conscious of their own understanding of power and who were willing to reinforce this power at any point in time. Although Ogunmola died over 100 years ago, ritual objects such as gunpowder, and cannon that we see here at his grave shrine in Bere connects people back to a history that now manifests in oral literature and, of course, in material culture. Similarly, Balogun Ibitole, another chief in Ibadan, his reputation transcends his possession of a large expanse of land. He is also remembered as Alotagetu Babu Sibai. Another Ibadan chief named Ulugbode received a great compliment for his lethal gun. Baale Ibadan, Onibon Asisori, Onibon Ajande Koko. One should not be surprised that the beginning of this presentation has deployed oral literature in unmasking how the gun became an African technology. A historian is drawn to core features of ritual, political, and gender power, domiciled or archived in oral literature. So the ritualization of the gun was made possible by a Yoruba culture that was flexible enough to appropriate certain characteristics of the gun with Ogun, the Yoruba god of intrepidity, of warfare, and of hiring. So, Ibikune, Ogunmola, Olugbode were great marksmen, not just because of their well-defined physical power, but also because they were loyal to Ogun. So, for me, in understanding how the gun became an African technology, we need to understand three particular processes. The first process was appropriation. The second was hybridization. And the last but not the least was reinvention. In appropriating the gun, especially within the context of gun boom or gun knots, one needs to be able to put into cognizance the history of sound making itself. For centuries, societies made sound. And in the context of Yoruba history, they made it with drums, with many objects. Sounds shape social, political, and even intellectual relations. The different sounds shaped the way societies engage one another. Different days of the week, different types of drums associated with different ceremonies, different individuals, religious identities. The heterogeneity of Yoruba religion itself can be found or can be further emphasized within the context of the kind of sound made with different kinds of different kinds of drum. The inroad of guns into Yoruba history changed everything. now that individuals are now beginning to make sound with guns. We know what transpired within the context of West African codes. Guns came in the 15th century, and their era was monopolized initially by chiefs, warlords, powerful people, making it very difficult for regular people to have access to guns. Because guns could only be used by the elite, it also meant basically that the sound it would make would be monopolized by the elite. So, in appropriating, in integrating gun sounds into Yoruba sound-making culture, the first thing that happened was that it was monopolized by the elite, military elites, warlords. And this continued to a large extent throughout the pre-colonial period until the 20th century, when what I call the liberalization of guns, which I expressed extensively in this book, happened. The liberalization of guns had to do with how colonialism transformed gun possession. In pre-colonial times, you can only have a gun if you are an elite. In the modern time, in the colonial period, it was a different situation. Colonialism made it possible for regular people who did not have anything to do with war and warfare to have access to guns. The implication is that the signs and avenues through which gun sound were manifesting expanded tremendously. So for the first time, regular people who did not have any history of technology or any history of warfare technology could now begin to use guns to make sound. Even women whose access to firearms was limited because few of them were involved in military confrontation, at least in parts of Yoruba land, now had access to the gun sound. So gun sound then became a marker of social class, it became a definer of identities, of location. And as this was going on, it was also shaping the ways in which individuals were associating themselves with the core infrastructures of the state. So that if you have a lot of money, the depth of the sound, gun sound or boom, made during your own funeral can be the marker of how your funeral will be remembered. So that the richest people could afford to spend as much as 70 barrels of gunpowder just to celebrate their own death, while the less rich ones or the poor could probably be only able to discharge 1 or 2 shots. How gun sounds became a factor in the ways in which societies were defining themselves is fascinating to me. I would like to go back to the question of appropriation within the context of warfare, which is the image I have here on the PowerPoint. And this will allow me to be able to talk about how the gun became an African heritage within the context of warfare. We still have a clear understanding of when this happened. In the 15th century, warfare, guns. Before the period, most cultures were using spear, bow, and arrow to fight. The obvious advantage of firearms transformed African warfare, not only because guns could, or firearms could, were more lethal, especially in the hand of a good marksman, but also because of the psychological implication they produced. The sound itself was terrifying, and the sound could actually compel enemies to even surrender even before it happened. The point in emphasis about this is that when gun came in as an instrument of warfare, it had to be recalibrated. And the recalibration had to do with how to use it. Initially, most African societies had troubles using guns because of innate technology. And according to many authors in the 15th, 16th, and 19th century, most of these firearms were not well used because most of them were not doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. People were experimenting. Gun arsenals were very high, and most of the guns were consuming a lot of gunpowder. It became counterproductive for most societies. They will probably continue to use their bow and arrow than to use firearms, right? But since we're going to be changing, one element of the change again is to locate it within the context of spirituality, and that was why your image about the top of the stretching object is fundamental, in which how do we make the guns to do what it can do better, beyond the obvious technological power assigned to it by its maker in Birmingham. In the concept in Birmingham. So the appropriation element then has to do with changing the way it works. Changing the way it probably works with, first and foremost, changing the butt of the gun to an African material to reduce importation. The second element could actually be spiritualizing it. And it is the spiritualization of the gun that is fundamental from our research. Ways in which you can begin to associate certain features of the gun with African gods, African goddess. Once you spiritualize something, you hold it. And the holding of the gun within the context of African spiritualization itself is what's significant. The hybridization is apparent. The gun will do exactly what it will do. But what the gun would do for a warrior in southwest Nigeria in the 19th century is exactly what it would do for, let's say, if someone using the same firearm in London or firearm elsewhere. However, the pattern of the warfare itself, the landscape itself, the timing itself, shaped the way it was used in military. And I would like to go too deep into the military aspect of it. But in making the gun to do exactly what it's supposed to do within the context of Africa, significant hybridization has to happen for it to work. The last but not the least is reinvention. Gun has to be reinvented. How do you reinvent it? You reinvent it by owning it. If you go to many parts of southwestern Nigeria today, most people would not agree with you that a gun or firearm is a Western technology. Historians know that it came from Europe, but most local communities will not agree. They will not agree because the pattern of Africanization of the gun has reached a point in which they think it is their own God. So the gun is actually a man. The man is a gun, the concept of masculinity. At the same time, the gun is not a European technology to most communities. It's an African technology. And it became an African technology because of 500 years of transformation.